Most people imagine the beheading of Charles I as a clean, almost dignified ending, as if a single swing of the axe simply closed a chapter in British history. But contemporary accounts reveal something far more disturbing. When the blade struck his neck on that freezing morning of January 30, 1649, the cut did not end the violence. Warm arterial blood burst from the wound in sudden rhythmic pulses, spraying across the white cloths like a living fountain fighting against death. Witnesses reported that the severed head continued to bleed for several minutes, the warmth steaming in the cold air, as if the body refused to accept what had happened. While popular portrayals show Charles dying calmly, the reality was a scene of violent muscle spasms. His shoulders jerked, his fingers curled inward, and a fine mist of blood drifted from the stump each time the heart tried to beat again. This was not ceremony. It was political theater, staged by Parliament to humiliate the monarchy in its final breath. And yet, beneath the spectacle stood a man shivering in the January wind, whispering his last words through trembling lips. To understand why Charles I faced death had to be staged as revenge, we must first examine the man who died that day. To understand the cruelty behind Charles I's execution, we must first understand the man who walked toward the scaffold that morning. Charles was not born a tyrant, nor crafted into a monster by destiny. He was shaped by a childhood steeped in ritual, hierarchy, and the unwavering belief that kings ruled by divine will. From an early age, he was taught that obedience to the crown was obedience to God himself, a worldview that would later collide violently with a nation demanding accountability. But Charles carried vulnerabilities that history books often soften or ignore. He battled a speech impediment that made public speaking agonizing. He was introverted, often uncomfortable in the very court he was expected to command. These weaknesses pushed him toward advisors who fed his fear, reinforced his rigid beliefs, and led him down paths of disastrous decisions. His religious reforms, fiscal overreach, and repeated dissolutions of Parliament deepened public distrust and pushed England toward the civil war that erupted in. While popular myth paints Charles simply as a stubborn king, contemporary records reveal a man trapped inside collapsing structures of power he did not know how to reform. To parliamentarians exhausted by war and enraged by the deaths of thousands, Charles became more than a political enemy. He became the symbol of every unchecked royal abuse stretching back generations. But Parliament had already concluded that Charles I represented something far more dangerous than a defeated king. They believed he embodied a system that had to be destroyed completely. While the public was told that Charles I would face a fair and necessary trial, the machinery behind his destruction reveals a very different truth. This was not justice. It was a carefully engineered act of political revenge. The key architects were men like Oliver Cromwell and Henry Ireton, leaders of the radical parliamentary faction, who believed England could not survive as long as the idea of divine kingship still lived. Their goal was not simply to punish Charles, but to break the centuries-old structure he represented. The first step in this plan was the creation of the High Court of Justice, a legal body with no historical precedent. It existed for one purpose only: to condemn a king. Historical documents confirm that many judges refused to participate. Horrified by the implications, Cromwell simply replaced them with men who would obey. The facade of legality had to be preserved, even if the foundation beneath it was hollow. At the same time, propaganda flooded the streets. Pamphlets labeled Charles a man of blood, blaming him for every casualty of the Civil War. Sermons painted him as a tyrant who had sacrificed his people for pride. Through repetition and fear, the public was guided to accept the unthinkable, that executing a king was not only justified, but necessary. This manipulation served a single purpose: to prepare England for a punishment unlike anything it had ever seen. The machinery of destruction was now in motion, but before the axe fell, Charles faced an even more insidious punishment. Long before Charles I stepped onto the scaffold, Parliament had already begun dismantling him from the inside. His imprisonment at Windsor and later at St. James's Palace was not simple confinement. It was a deliberate system of psychological pressure. Guards rotated constantly, preventing him from forming trust or routine. Basic comforts associated with royal status were removed piece by piece, forcing him to confront his helplessness in the most intimate ways. Even information was weaponized. Messages arrived late or not at all, leaving him suspended in uncertainty. While popular accounts suggest he spent these final weeks in dignified calm, contemporary letters reveal a harsher picture. Charles was subjected to subtle interrogation tactics, unexpected questioning, forced silences, and emotional isolation designed to break down royal authority. During the trial, he was denied the right to speak, treated as a criminal rather than a sovereign. Each moment served one purpose: to strip away the identity he had been raised to believe was sacred. Clinically, Charles coped by retreating inward. He relied on ritualized prayer, controlled breathing, and a growing fixation on martyrdom, classic responses to extreme powerlessness. By the morning of January 30, 1649, Charles I had been psychologically executed long before the blade touched his neck. The execution of Charles I is often remembered as a clean, almost ceremonial moment: an axe raised, a head taken, a crowd watching in respectful silence. But eyewitness accounts describe something far colder, far more calculated, and far more violent than the popular image suggests. The scaffold built outside the banqueting house was not chosen for convenience. It was chosen for symbolism. Charles would die beneath the very ceiling where painters had once celebrated the divine glory of kingship. Now that glory was being wiped away with wood, nails, and frost. The morning air of January 13, 1649 was brutally cold. Physicians note that such temperatures constrict the skin, tighten muscles, and slow peripheral blood flow, changes that would intensify the body's reaction to sudden trauma. Charles stepped onto the platform, wrapped in heavy black clothing to hide the shiver running through him. His breath came out in pale fog. Every inhalation felt like swallowing ice. The executioners, masked to avoid recognition, stood silent. Their very stillness served as intimidation. These were professionals, chosen not for mercy but for efficiency. When Charles placed his neck on the block, the crowd leaned forward, hearing only the crack of winter wood beneath his weight. The axe fell with a force meant to sever vertebrae, arteries, and muscle in one violent instant, but the moment after impact shattered the myth of the clean beheading. Warm arterial blood burst upward in a sudden, rhythmic fountain, staining the pristine cloths, laid out to preserve dignity. Witnesses reported that the pulse continued for several seconds, each spurt a reminder that the heart did not surrender immediately. Charles's body reacted violently. His shoulders jerked, his hands clawed instinctively at nothing, and a fine red mist drifted in the air each time the heart attempted one final beat. The severed head, when lifted, showed faint twitches around the mouth and eyelids, brief electrical impulses firing through a brain not yet fully silent. The crowd did not cheer. Contemporary journals describe a wave of trembling gasps and quiet cries spreading through the onlookers. The people fell into great shudderings and tears. One witness wrote, horrified by the raw humanity of the scene. But the theater was not over. The executioner held the head high, letting the cold January steam rise from the neck like smoke from extinguished royalty. But the cruelest chapter was not the execution itself. It was what Parliament did to the king's body afterward. The violence did not end when Charles I's head fell. What followed was a deliberate attempt to erase the horror the public had just witnessed. Parliament moved quickly, almost frantically, to control the narrative. The king's body was taken away under strict guard, not out of respect, but out of fear that any display of grief might turn him into a martyr. Public mourning was forbidden. Anyone who spoke too loudly of sorrow risked imprisonment. The body was buried hastily at Windsor in a cold chamber without ceremony, its location initially kept secret. Even in death, the manipulation continued. His embalming mask, created soon after the beheading, intentionally softened the brutality of the wound. The jagged tear left by the axe was smoothed into something cleaner, something less shocking. Portraits painted later showed Charles serene, composed, almost holy images carefully crafted to counter the chaos of his final moments. Meanwhile, parliamentary propaganda flooded London. Printed pamphlets insisted the execution had been necessary, justice, a godly correction rather than a political revenge ritual. Over the years, textbooks and official histories repeated this sanitized version, replacing a scene of blood, steam, and shuddering flesh with a dignified royal passing. But history does not stay buried, and over time, Charles's legacy began to shift. In the years that followed Charles I's death, the truth Parliament tried to bury began to rise again. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the nation saw his execution not as justice, but as a warning about what happens when political fury replaces lawful order. Charles was declared a martyr by the Church of England, and his executioners, those who had engineered every step of his downfall, faced the fate they once inflicted. Some were hunted across Europe, others dragged through the streets, and several were themselves executed in public squares. History had begun its slow work of balancing the scales. Modern historians and psychologists now view Charles's death as a case study in state-orchestrated humiliation. The trial, the propaganda, the isolation, each step mirrored tactics used in later centuries by governments seeking to erase opponents under the cover of legality. The lesson is universal and painfully relevant. Whenever a society becomes polarized enough to turn a leader into a symbol of hatred, truth becomes the first casualty. Charles I was not a perfect ruler, but the brutality of his end reveals more about power than about the man himself. In the end, Charles I's beheading was not justice, it was theater, and theater, no matter how bloodless it pretends to be, always leaves a stain on the stage.